This is a hardware wallet, a Trezor Model T, specifically, purchased in 2021 for $219. It's slightly scratched from years of handling. The screen has a small crack in the corner from when I dropped it on a tile floor. It's not impressive to look at. Inside this device, protected by a pin I memorized and a 24-word seed phrase written on steel plates stored in two separate locations, sits 2.7 Bitcoin. At today's prices, approximately $267,000. Not a fortune by crypto standards, not enough to retire on, but enough to matter. Here's what makes this device different from the Bitcoin in your Coinbase account, your Kraken wallet, your Fidelity brokerage, or your shares of iBit. If someone wants to take this Bitcoin, they need to physically take this device from my hands, extract the pin through coercion or luck, and hope I haven't already moved the funds to a backup wallet using the seed phrase I memorized. The Bitcoin on exchanges, the Bitcoin in ETFs, that Bitcoin can be frozen with an email, seized with a court order, restricted with a software update pushed at 3 a.m. while you're sleeping. The entity holding your keys can comply with any demand from any authority, and you'll find out when you try to withdraw and discover the option has been disabled. In the next 7 days, that distinction transforms from theoretical concern to operational reality. And if you're still holding Bitcoin in custodial accounts when the clock runs out, you may discover that what you thought you owned was actually a claim on Bitcoin, a claim that can be modified, restricted, or voided by entities whose interests are not aligned with yours. February 5th, 2026. That's the date. That's the deadline you don't know exists. And what happens on that date will divide Bitcoin holders into two categories: those who prepared and those who didn't. Here's what they're not telling you. On January 15th, 2026, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, published a final rule in the Federal Register titled Enhanced Due Diligence Requirements for Convertible Virtual Currency Transactions. The rule is 847 pages long. It received minimal media coverage because FinCEN published it on the same day that news broke about UBS's resolution, guaranteeing that financial journalists would focus on the banking crisis rather than regulatory fine print. The rule takes effect February 5th, 21 days from publication to implementation, the shortest implementation window for major financial regulation in FinCEN's history. Page 312 contains the provision that matters. Under the header, Custodial Wallet Providers, Transaction Monitoring and Restriction Requirements, the rule mandates that all U.S. registered cryptocurrency exchanges implement automated transaction screening with mandatory 72-hour hold periods for withdrawals exceeding $10,000 equivalent, pending enhanced verification of recipient address ownership. Let me translate that from regulatory language to plain English. Starting February 5th, if you try to withdraw more than $10,000 in Bitcoin from Coinbase, Kraken, Gemini, or any U.S. exchange, your withdrawal will be delayed for 72 hours minimum, while the exchange verifies that you control the wallet you're withdrawing to. The verification process, detailed in Appendix C of the rule, requires you to prove ownership of the receiving address through cryptographic signature, identity documentation, and, critically, disclosure of the address to FinCEN's new Blockchain Analytics Unit for monitoring and pattern analysis. Every self-custody wallet that receives more than $10,000 from a U.S. exchange will be logged in a federal database. The address, the owner's identity, the transaction history, all of it captured, stored, and available for analysis by Treasury Department officials whose stated mission is disrupting illicit finance networks. Your hardware wallet, the device you bought specifically to escape surveillance, becomes a tracked address the moment you withdraw to it through compliant channels. But that's not the provision that should concern you most. Page 347 details Emergency Restriction Authority. In the event of market volatility, cybersecurity incident, or national security determination, custodial wallet providers may implement temporary withdrawal restrictions without advance notice, pending regulatory guidance on appropriate customer protection measures. The exchanges now have explicit federal authorization to freeze withdrawals, without warning, without explanation, without timeline, whenever regulators determine that market volatility, or national security, justifies restriction. And market volatility is not defined. It's whatever FinCEN says it is. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The Bitcoin in your exchange account is not your Bitcoin. It never was. The exchange holds the private keys. The exchange controls the ability to move those funds. You hold a claim, an IOU from the exchange promising to honor withdrawal requests. That IOU has always been conditional. The terms of service you clicked through without reading contained provisions allowing the exchange to restrict withdrawals during extraordinary circumstances. The new FinCEN rule doesn't create new restrictions. It federalizes existing restrictions and removes any ambiguity about when they can be invoked. The paper versus physical distinction that applies to gold applies with even greater force to Bitcoin. Paper Bitcoin, exchange balances, ETF shares, custodial wallets, is a claim on Bitcoin controlled by someone else. Physical Bitcoin, cryptocurrency secured by keys you control, is actual possession. Paper can be frozen, physical cannot. Paper depends on counterparty cooperation. Physical depends only on your own security practices. Paper is subject to every regulation, every court order, every emergency restriction that authorities choose to impose. Physical exists outside institutional control. That's literally why Satoshi created it. The FinCEN rule makes the distinction operational. Before February 5th, withdrawing from exchanges to self-custody was frictionless. After February 5th, withdrawing becomes surveilled, delayed, and potentially restricted. The bridge between paper Bitcoin and physical Bitcoin narrows dramatically. Those who cross the bridge before February 5th retain the option to hold Bitcoin as it was designed to be held: censorship-resistant, self-sovereign, beyond institutional reach. Those who wait may find the bridge closed, or so encumbered with surveillance that crossing defeats the purpose. When institutions do what they're doing now, they're not implementing consumer protection. They're establishing control infrastructure. At 9:30 a.m. Eastern on January 24th, Coinbase filed an 8K supplement with the SEC disclosing system modifications to ensure compliance with FinCEN Rule 2026-1, including implementation of enhanced address verification protocols and integration with Treasury Department monitoring systems. Coinbase isn't fighting the rule, Coinbase is implementing it. The company that built its brand on making cryptocurrency accessible is now building the surveillance apparatus that makes cryptocurrency traceable. The filing includes a notable detail on page 7. The company anticipates that compliance implementation may result in temporary service limitations during the transition period, including potential delays in withdrawal processing as verification systems are calibrated. Temporary service limitations. Potential delays. The language is careful, but the meaning is clear. Withdrawals will be affected. The smooth, instant transfers you've taken for granted will become slower, more scrutinized, more likely to trigger holds or requests for additional documentation. Kraken filed similar disclosure on January 25th, Gemini on January 26th. Every major U.S. exchange is racing to build compliance infrastructure before the February 5th deadline. The infrastructure they're building is surveillance infrastructure, address tracking, identity matching, pattern analysis, that transforms self-custody from a privacy-preserving choice into a monitored activity. Less than 7 days remain before the rule takes effect. The exchanges are implementing now. The systems are being tested now. The database that will track every withdrawal address is being populated now. At 2:15 p.m. Eastern on January 28th, the Bitcoin blockchain recorded an unusual pattern. Withdrawal transactions from known exchange hot wallets spiked to 47,000 in a 6-hour window, more than triple the normal volume. The total value moved, approximately $4.2 billion. Someone, actually many someones, are withdrawing before February 5th. The sophisticated participants who read FinCEN publications, who understand what surveillance infrastructure means, who value the self-sovereignty that Bitcoin was designed to provide, they're crossing the bridge while crossing is still straightforward. The exchange balances are declining. Coinbase's publicly reported Bitcoin holdings have fallen 12% since January 15th. Kraken's have fallen 9%. The outflows are accelerating as the deadline approaches. The question is not whether the rule matters. The withdrawals prove it matters. The question is whether you understand why it matters before the implementation window closes. While one side restricts, the other side positions for a world without restrictions. At 7 a.m. Singapore time on January 26th, 6 p.m. Eastern the previous day, the Monetary Authority of Singapore published updated guidance for cryptocurrency businesses operating in the city-state. The guidance explicitly declines to implement withdrawal restrictions comparable to FinCEN's rule. Instead, Singapore's framework emphasizes transaction privacy consistent with anti-money laundering objectives, without routine surveillance of self-custody transfer. The contrast is deliberate. Singapore is positioning itself as the jurisdiction where cryptocurrency operates as cryptocurrency was designed to operate, with privacy, with self-sovereignty, with minimal institutional intermediation. The United States is positioning itself as the jurisdiction where cryptocurrency operates as traditional finance with blockchain branding, fully surveilled, fully controlled, fully integrated with government monitoring systems. The geographic arbitrage is already underway. Since January 15th, new account registrations at Singapore-based exchanges have increased 340% among users with US IP addresses accessed through VPNs. The Americans who understand what February 5th means are establishing offshore access before onshore access becomes encumbered. Dubai's VARA has published similar guidance. No withdrawal restrictions, no address surveillance, no mandatory reporting of self-custody transfers. Hong Kong's regime, while more restrictive than Singapore's, still permits straightforward withdrawal without 72-hour holds or address disclosure requirements. The world is bifurcating. Jurisdictions that want to attract cryptocurrency capital are maintaining operational freedom. Jurisdictions that want to control cryptocurrency are building surveillance infrastructure. The United States has chosen the second path. The BRICS nations' digital asset framework, announced at the January summit, includes explicit provisions protecting self-custody. Member states recognize that self-custody digital assets represent sovereign individual holdings not subject to routine institutional monitoring, absent specific legal process. The language is diplomatic, but the meaning is pointed. While America builds surveillance systems, the BRICS bloc codifies privacy protections. The regulatory competition that shapes capital flows is actively steering cryptocurrency infrastructure away from U.S. jurisdiction. This is what a system looks like when it runs out of time. The FinCEN rule wasn't developed in response to genuine money laundering concerns. Treasury's own data shows that cryptocurrency represents less than 1% of global money laundering volume, a fraction of the illicit flows through traditional banking channels. The rule was developed because Bitcoin's design threatens the surveillance capability that modern financial regulation depends upon. Every transaction in traditional finance passes through institutions that record, report, and respond to government demands. Bitcoin, held properly, bypasses that infrastructure entirely. The threat is not that Bitcoin enables crime. Cash remains the overwhelming tool of choice for illicit finance. The threat is that Bitcoin enables privacy. Privacy for ordinary people. Privacy for political dissidents. Privacy for anyone who prefers that their financial life not be cataloged in government databases. That privacy is intolerable to institutions whose power depends on surveillance. The FinCEN rule is one response among many, a systematic effort to close the gap between Bitcoin's theoretical privacy and the practical reality of how most people actually hold it. If most Bitcoin is held on exchanges, and exchanges are fully surveilled, then Bitcoin's privacy properties become theoretical rather than operational. The surveillance captures the activity. The blockchain's pseudonymity becomes meaningless when every address is linked to an identity in Treasury databases. The rule succeeds by making self-custody harder, slower, more surveilled. Each friction point added to withdrawal processes nudges users toward keeping Bitcoin on exchanges, where it's controlled by entities that comply with government demands. The trap is not mandatory custody. The trap is optional custody that becomes the path of least resistance. The trap is surveillance that's easier to accept than to avoid. The trap is privacy rights abandoned through convenience rather than coercion. February 5th is when the trap activates. Before that date, withdrawal is straightforward. After that date, withdrawal means 72-hour holds, address disclosure, pattern monitoring, and the possibility of emergency restrictions at any moment regulators deem appropriate. The 7-day window is not about whether self-custody remains possible. It's about whether self-custody remains practical, whether crossing from paper to physical Bitcoin involves friction that defeats the purpose of crossing. The question for every Bitcoin holder is simple. What do you actually want to own? If you want exposure to Bitcoin's price, the ability to profit when the number goes up, then exchange custody and ETF shares provide that. You'll participate in appreciation. You'll bear the risks of counterparty dependency, regulatory restriction, and surveillance. That's a valid choice. Many people will make it. If you want to own Bitcoin, the censorship-resistant, self-sovereign asset that Satoshi designed, then self-custody is the only option. The price exposure is identical. The properties are completely different. Paper Bitcoin can be frozen. Your exchange balance can become inaccessible during market volatility or national security events. Categories so broad they encompass any scenario where governments decide restriction serves their interests. Physical Bitcoin cannot be frozen. The keys are yours. The network validates your holdings. No email from a compliance department can change your balance. No court order can redirect your funds without your cryptographic signature. The FinCEN rule doesn't eliminate self-custody. It makes the transition from paper to physical more surveilled and more subject to delay. It creates a record of everyone who moves Bitcoin to addresses they control. It builds the database that future enforcement actions might target. Those who transition before February 5th avoid the surveillance. Their withdrawal addresses are processed under current rules, logged by exchanges for their own records, but not reported to FinCEN's new monitoring system. Their self-custody is established without creating federal records of their wallet addresses. Those who transition after February 5th create records. Their addresses enter the database. Their future transactions on those addresses become potentially traceable through the identity link established at withdrawal. The privacy that self-custody is supposed to provide is compromised at the moment of acquisition. This is not financial advice. This is observation about what the regulatory calendar shows. The FinCEN rule exists. The implementation date is fixed. The surveillance infrastructure is being built. The sophisticated participants are withdrawing. The exchange balances are declining. The pattern is visible in the data for anyone willing to look. What you do with that pattern is your decision. But the decision has a timeline. Those who understand what's happening are not waiting for clarity. The 47,000 withdrawal transactions on January 28th represent understanding translated into action. The 12% decline in Coinbase holdings represents understanding distributed across thousands of individual decisions. Each withdrawal is a vote, a statement that the holder prefers physical Bitcoin to paper Bitcoin, prefers self-sovereignty to institutional dependency, prefers the friction of self-custody to the surveillance of exchange custody. The votes are being cast now. The voting window closes February 5th, not because self-custody becomes impossible, but because self-custody becomes surveilled, and surveillance defeats the purpose for many holders. Reality asserts itself through regulatory deadlines and compliance implementations. The FinCEN rule is not a proposal or a possibility. It's published in the Federal Register with a fixed effective date. The exchanges are building compliance systems right now. The database is being prepared right now. 7 days remain. Not as metaphor, as calendar fact. 7 days to decide whether the Bitcoin you hold is the Bitcoin you want to hold. 7 days to move from paper to physical while the bridge remains unsurveilled. 7 days to understand that your Bitcoin on an exchange is actually their Bitcoin with your name attached. Bitcoin that exists at the pleasure of institutions whose compliance obligations now explicitly include surveillance and restriction capabilities. The hardware wallet on my desk, scratched, cracked, unremarkable, holds Bitcoin that no FinCEN rule can freeze, no emergency restriction can touch, no 72-hour hold can delay. The Bitcoin on your exchange account exists in a different category, a category that becomes more restricted, more surveilled, more subject to institutional control with each regulatory implementation. February 5th adds surveillance. The next rule may add restrictions. The rule after that may add reporting requirements for self-custody itself. The trajectory is clear. The direction is toward control. The window to step outside that trajectory is open for 7 more days. The sophisticated money is already stepping through. The exchange outflows show it. The wallet activation data shows it. The pattern is unmistakable if you know what to look for. What remains is your decision. Paper or physical, surveillance or sovereignty, claims or possession. 7 days is not a long time. It is, however, enough time. Enough time to research hardware wallets and order one. Even if delivery takes weeks, the decision is made. Enough time to test a small withdrawal and verify the process works. Enough time to learn the basics of self-custody that seemed intimidating but become manageable with practice. Enough time to understand that Bitcoin's value proposition was never about number going up. It was about money that cannot be controlled, seized, or surveilled by institutions whose interests diverge from yours. Exchange custody forfeits that value proposition. ETF shares never offered it. Only self-custody, keys you control, addresses no one else can access, delivers what Bitcoin was actually designed to provide. The FinCEN rule doesn't change Bitcoin. It changes the cost of holding Bitcoin as Bitcoin was meant to be held. That cost increases on February 5th. The calendar shows 7 days. The decision is yours. The window is closing. Not gradually, not eventually. On a date, at a time, specified in federal regulation. What you do before that date determines what category of Bitcoin holder you become. Those who hold keys hold Bitcoin. Those who hold claims hold promises. Promises that can be modified, delayed, or revoked by institutions complying with rules you never agreed to. The difference between these categories becomes operational on February 5th. 7 days to choose which category you occupy. The clock is not metaphorical. It's regulatory. It's published. It's counting down whether you're watching or not. 7 days.